think I understand Albanian now. I understood everything you just said. Is that good? Oh, okay. Thank you for having me. I've been here for less than 48 hours, but I feel already very close to Pristina, and want to come back as soon as possible. We've been having this workshop here for the past 2 days, and I see some of the participants here in the audience. The theme of the workshop, originally the title was Reimagining Museums, but I changed the title of the lecture now to Imagining Museums, because I realized maybe it's not a reimagination, because re implies that there is already something, but it's imagination, like really inventing something new and trying to kind of cross out everything that's been and create a new environment. As already was said, I just started my own practice only a couple of months ago, so this is actually kind of a critical time for me, and it was hard to get away because we're just starting our first projects, build projects, and it is Sibila soon because it is a partnership between me and Matt Chut, who is from Malaysia, and his name is Chin Sun Chut, and my first name before I was Bika was also Sibila, so this is a use of that name, Sibila Sun. And we're based in New York and in Vienna. And in New York, I'm part of the GSAP incubator, which is kind of a workspace, incubator space based at a new museum. So it's also kind of museum-related environment. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then I'm teaching at Columbia, and I've been teaching representation there, so drawing basically. And now I'll also be teaching museum studies and exhibition design. And I think this workshop for me is so interesting. I feel like I already learned a lot also from my class there, and it already changed my thinking about how to teach and think about museums. And for the past 2 years before I started my own practice, I was at the Met, so that was sort of my school, my museum school. And just to quickly show you what I do when I basically. The first few slides are what I'm not going to talk about, which is my office work right now, the kind of design work, the daily grind right now of design. We're doing an office building, and I'm very much focused on this museum topic, but as an architect also, whatever you can get your fingers on, you do in the beginning, and I feel you learn from everything, so it's also really, really fun to do those. And then there's also a kind of cultural center, a little extension in Lower Austria that we're doing right now. And we're starting construction in like 2 weeks, so it's crazy right now. It's very intense, and we're doing the detailed drawings for that. But back to museum thinking and galleries and exhibitions. And I'll divide the lecture into 2 parts. First, I will talk more about my installation work and how I even got interested in sort of this type of temporary structures and ephemeral structures, because the way that there's always long chains of connection, but the way that I got invited here is part of the Future Architecture platform, and they always ask you to talk about the future and what do you think the future is going to be, and I stated kind of provocatively, which I don't really know if it's necessarily true in that sense, but I wanted to put something strong out there, is that the future of architecture is light, ephemeral, and constantly changing. And so we've been exploring the topic in different ways, and museums, I think, are one way that an architecture is never finished but constantly evolves and changes. And the institution itself is an example, but another one is we're basically doing a series of installations and physical products that we're developing over time. And this was at the House of Architecture in Graz, and it was a collaboration between Sibila Sun and an Italian young company called Amore Agency. And it was an exercise in creating a temporary structure very fast, but it was also an exercise in not designing it beforehand. So we really, we only had this very, very rough sketch you see on the right as a drawing before we actually made the installation, which, you know, as an idea you can also see it just allows for a lot of flexibility, because architects tend to overthink and over-design things in a way ahead of time. There's a culture of representation and of drawing where everything needs to be very specifically described, as in what we have to do here. So in a way it's an attempt to escape that. And in the last lecture it was mentioned this problem of having too much distance between being in the computer and doing the drawings, and in a way not really fully engaging with what is built. And so this is the other extreme, where the drawing is not defining anything at all. And then we built this this installation there that was in a storefront of the gallery, and basically people who would walk by, the idea was that it was a curtain that was hanging there, they would see it, they would maybe get curious because it was open to the street, and they would come inside, and we wanted to create a pocket of space that was sort of inviting visitors to come onto the interior. And when you were inside, so this is, you see here, this is from the outside the view, and when you're on the inside, you're actually looking out on the street. So you got this very, you got this strong relationship between the gallery and the inhabitant. And what it created was a kind of, you know, showcase for the people who were actually experiencing the installation. So you would be inside, walking around, and you would actually be on display as well in that moment. And for the opening, we also created a performance. So this column was brought from Italy. It's a real marble column, and you know, you can see it inverts the relationship of architecture as being solid, and what's inside as being movable and light. So basically, you know, the object that is the furniture, so to say, is something extremely permanent and will survive the installation infinitely. And it is also very precious, and it is detailed and you know, stiff and very heavy. I couldn't lift that column. While the exterior, which is usually the solid part, has become this very translucent, ambiguous, constantly moving, transparent fabric. And this is another screenshot. And we worked with the same material and produced more direct results. And that's also, you know, related to the seminar that's going to happen in the fall, which should be very much integrated with different institutions in New York and even beyond, to kind of basically develop a methodology of museum workings or museum, let's say, processes and workflows in ways that things are functioning. So, and this is sort of the transition to talking a bit more specifically about a case study, which is the Met Breuer. For those who are not familiar, I mean, I showed some of this work in detail this afternoon to my students, but it's a building by Marcel Breuer that was built in 1966, and we reopened it again in 2016 with the Met, and so it had a 50-year anniversary, but also a huge change. Basically, for 50 years, it was inhabited by one institution, which is the Whitney Museum. And so so it was also very much branded with that institution. Every New Yorker, if you would say, it was actually called, the building was called the Whitney, and everyone, you would talk to them and they were like, oh, we're going to the Whitney, and they would think about that building. Because you can also see on the image, it's a very strong building. It's brutalist building, it's concrete, it's really heavy, really massive, really unusual for a museum, and actually also quite impractical to be a museum. So with the Met, we took it on as part of our collection. So as an art piece, it's not even a building, or it is a building, but it's the building that's part of the Met's collection in that sense, and the way that you would restore an art piece very carefully and try to sort of treat it with gloves that same way we wanted to treat the building before the reopening. And at the same time make it very clear that there's a new institution that has come in, and that people kind kind of started thinking of it not as the Whitney, but as the Met Breuer. Here just included some original sketches by Marcel Breuer, and it's interesting to see those because he designed this beautiful grid on the ceiling, but it wasn't just beautiful, it had, you know, the idea that there would be exhibition walls that would always adapt, they would just always be within the grid, and they would be reusable. You could have, you could mount an infinite amount of modernist exhibition spaces always within that grid, and it sounds really good, but it became really impractical very quickly, and they were like trashed and never used again, the walls. In reality, because in the end, still, you know, museums, I mean, art requires, each art requires different conditions to be looked at, and it seems like they would be similar, but actually it's very hard to define or to design flexible systems that work for everything. And this was the, you know, there's basically a sunken garden, and then there's a bridge that leads into the building, which also I'll show later how it changed. And so when I came into the project, the building looked like this. So it was a complete construction site, and the lobby was, you know, all the lights were completely in disarray, and everything was just changing. And here just some images of how it looked before. So it was a very crowded, very lived-in, very messy museum. I mean, it was actually charming, but you know, it was not really what the Met wanted to represent. The Met is all about, in a way, we wanted to make it very clean and new, and sort of get rid of all that clutter and junk that had accumulated over time. And so the very first task was to deal with the lobby and to think about how that lobby, you know, would really welcome visitors in the best way. And you know, you can constantly, I mean, I ask you to now think about the museum here, because this is really why I came to think about this museum. And if I talk about the lobby here, think about the lobby here, and what did you experience when you walked in? And also, don't forget, we're inside of a museum right now. You know, you're in this space, you're in a lecture theater, but actually you're in a museum. So what does it mean? You're looking at all these empty cases. Would it change the space if there would be some sculpture inside or something precious in here? It probably would feel really different. But this way, this is kind of symptomatic, I feel, of the space we're in. We're kind of in this ghost of a museum. We're in it, you know, but it's not. But what's actually defining the museum, the art, is not here yet. Or not here yet. It's on a break. It's taking vacation. It's gonna come back. It was here and it's gonna come back. So for the lobby, you know, we looked at, in a way, Marcel Breuer is quite an important architect, and you can just insert something in his building without carefully studying what he's doing and being in a way respectful, but at the same time, the idea was to create also something that new, that doesn't look like, you know, that doesn't look like it's been there before during Whitney's time. And so the solution that we came up with was to look at ruled surfaces, because they're very, not unique necessarily. I mean, other architects have used them, but they're prominent in Marcel Breuer's work. But he has not used them in the Whitney Museum. But so the ticketing desk at the lobby, and this is a rendering now that we did about 6 months before opening, which is like the time that we have now between when the Kosovo Museum opens and the opening in February 2018. Or actually, we have even a little bit more. Yeah. So the idea was that, you know, we take this geometry that is already inherent in the Marcel Breuer, but bring it into a contemporary language, and this table was basically having that same twist and looked almost parametric, but it was actually just kind of a sort of reference to his work. And this was the photograph that was taken 6 months later. So it's kind of uncanny how similar they're looking. And another, I almost like the rendering better actually, which can also happen sometimes. And then the big change, except for the ticketing desk, was the digital screen. So, you know, we're very much advocating, and that was also something, a difficult decision in a historic building, to put in a very large screen, because it could look tacky. But we wanted to really be able to have real-time information. So if you think of the museum as not just a place where you look at art, but where something is happening, and I hope those things here, like lectures like that, continue to happen here even when it's officially open. Then there's something going on, and people should know right away when they walk in what's on. And so that was the idea behind that, and just provide constant information. And the Met also has 3 different locations, so there was really a lot to put there. So that's why we needed 12 meters of space. This is actually about the desk still. So this was just, again, showing a little bit of process. Everything we designed, we had to test, and this particular shape of the desk came also out of the requirement for it to be ADA. So, which is also something we talk about in the workshop a lot. How do you make spaces accessible? How do you design for people of all sizes and sort of all capabilities? And this was the test in a wheelchair of how you can buy a ticket in a wheelchair. And that's how the end profile of the table came about. And the other profile was a triangle, and the shape was basically a loft between those two. And yeah, this was a beautiful walnut kind of wooden material. That was how it was built, almost before opening. And this is so part of the renovation was of course also the first exhibition, and it was an exhibition titled Unfinished, and it was exploring basically 300 years of unfinished art, which also would change as a definition. So unfinishedness maybe in the 19th century would mean something else than today. But so it was a very, very challenging exhibition because we had over 200 discrete pieces of art that had very, very different requirements. So the setting had to be very neutral, and we had to work with the grid and the new building and really figure out how things would work. And one of the most challenging elements was this sculpture plinth, where all this different sculpture, Rodin had to come together with a contemporary Polish sculptor. So it was sort of quite difficult to achieve that. This is the general layout of the exhibition, so you see a bit the scope of it. And here again, I'm comparing a bit the rendering and the reality. So this is when we're previewing the exhibition, and you see this is the Turner room, and Goya here, and then the next image was when it was built. So we were pretty close, not as close as with the lobby. And this is an image during install when they were hanging a Picasso on the at the entrance wall, an unfinished Picasso, and this is something about museums that I love the most, and where I feel I'm much closer to the art. Or if you talk about this distance between, if I talk about the distance in architecture between the creation and or the drawing and then the actual building, there's another distance in the museum, which is the distance between you and the artwork, which is also sometimes very, very difficult to grasp, or difficult to bridge, let's say. And where artworks are the most exposed is when they're being installed, when they're about to, it feels like, oh, it could fall down, or it could break, or it's this very precious object, and I felt it was the first time I really saw a Picasso. So how do you do an exhibition that actually emphasizes or that keeps that moment in the show itself? I don't really know. Maybe those guys have to keep holding it for 3 months. But even today we talked about, can we look into the storage? Is there a way that we don't just look at art in this museum here in a formulaic way within this glass box? Or are we able to actually experience it in the way that somebody who works in a museum experiences it? And this was then the process, and then the final product, how it was very quaint, sitting on a wall. It's on a grey wall, and now it's back to being a normal Picasso for me, but it was still very nice. And here's some of those renderings of the previews that we made of the plinth that I showed earlier. And here's also the process of when we build it. And this is also when I realized the big disconnect between when we architects draw something and we think it's really, really clear, and we show it to curators and to people in the museum, and they're like, oh yeah, it looks great. And then they see the build structure and they're like, oh my god, this is not at all what I was thinking. And they, you know, we had to actually rebuild that plinth because everything was at the wrong height for them. And it was really because they couldn't read the drawings. So again, it's something you have to kind of see it in full size. You have to test it, and then it will. Only then will you really understand it physically, because your body needs to relate to the sculpture and the objects in the space. And this was then the final installation of how it looked like after rebuilding it under extreme time pressure right before the opening. And this is the same. In the back, you see Marcel Breuer's famous triangular window. For those who know it. And then, it went on to details. We designed the benches. Also, something we talked about in the workshop. How do we? It's a really important element. Again, just like the cafeteria or other elements of the museum. If you look at it as a holistic experience, the moment when you walk through a gallery for a long time and you can sit down. And so we made those custom benches that are very, very simple and very subdued, and especially when you have a show like Unfinished with 200 artworks, you need something that steps back, that isn't flashy. And it was working with the grid, Marcel Breuer's very strict ceiling grid that is running. And this was, because we were opening the museum, and that's also something to think about, for the museum here. So how do you celebrate the opening? Which is crazy, because not only do we have to renovate the museum and open an exhibition, you also have to kind of think about that special event, the opening ceremony, so to say. And in this case, also it was historic building, so you couldn't really touch the facade. We were thinking about projections and banners and this and that. And then we came up with this idea of the inverted red carpet, which in a place like the Met also has a special meaning. There's the Met Gala, which all the stars come in and they walk on the red carpet and they feel fabulous. And this was the democratic version, where you can have the red carpet. And also it was the fastest design task I've ever done, because it was a rectangle in Photoshop. And this was the build version. So here, actually, the visualization and reality were quite close. Of course, like with anything, there was a lot of testing and to find the right method, because we obviously couldn't just paint on a building. And then we found this vinyl that you can apply with heat, and then you can remove it without any trace. But I thought it was quite beautiful to be in a red carpet for once. So, and then at the Met there was a lot of different exhibitions. And shows I worked on. I focused now on the Met Breuer because I feel it is the most relevant for this here, because you're also just kind of recreating this institution, and there's just all these questions. And I guess I'm just saying it's always difficult to go through that process, but then in the end it always kind of works out magically. But I wanted to just show one other example, which was the fashion show last year. So every year the Met puts on a really, really big fashion show, and this was basically, it was just a press opening, and but at the Met for a press opening you would have like $100,000. Don't ask me why. It's up for 1 hour, and it's just this event where people take photos. But this is how it is. So we created this extra large light sculpture, which was like 6 meters tall, out of neon lights, just for the event. And this is Andrew Bolton, the head curator of at the Met, kind of introducing the exhibition. And so you see kind of the scale of that piece. Not actually, it might be more than 6 meters. This is in the Great Hall at the Met. Then the good news was that the sculpture was so nice that they reused it in the exhibition. Actually, they didn't throw it away as it was originally planned. And you can see it here a little bit in the back. This was so the exhibition was designed by OMA. It was called Manus Ex Machina, so that's why it had this big X. And we were, as an in-house designer, you're in this very strange role of, you're not really, you're not doing the fun part, you're not designing, but you have to really negotiate between the institution and making sure everything works, and the architect, which is kind of unthankful when you're an architect yourself, but sometimes you get to design cute little things, like I was able to design the plinth for the wedding dress by Karl Lagerfeld, which is also quite stressful because of course the piece didn't arrive until the very last minute, and we weren't sure if this really long train of the wedding dress would fit onto the plinth, and then it came just when Anna Wintour was in the space, and it fit, and it was slightly nerve-wracking, but it worked out. Yeah, I'll conclude with one last project, which was also done at the Met, at the Met Boy actually, which was kind of commissioned by the education department, and they wanted to create a collaborative drawing, and it was for Family Day, and it's this kind of event that's usually quite, I don't want to say cheesy, but it's like a bunch of kids and not like with pens doing things, and you don't really want to come close. But here the idea was, how can you make this appealing and aesthetic? And so we created this drawing table with 3 different heights and an infinitely long paper roll that would just refresh every so often when it became full of scribbles. And we created custom drawing tools so that all the drawing tools would have one color and have a funny, really bold, strong shapes, and not just the regular ready-made tools. But it was all very, very simple, very cheap. I mean, this was just laser cut of the local, with the local laser cutter, and built out of plywood. And this is the installation plan. These are the 3 different sizes of chairs, so they had the really tiny ones. And this is when it was in intense action by all different sizes of people. And for me, this project, as much as it was kind of fast and sloppy, it sort of signifies how museums can really bring people together, and how museums are, they're about learning and viewing and understanding, but they're also about creating, and they're also about community and really sort of having fun in the end. Yeah. That's it for the lecture. And if there are any questions, I would love to answer them.